Hello, and today we're going to be painting an old Warhammer Legend. The reason why is because it's a good model for beginners to learn basic color theory and how to do basic blending and shades. I've gone ahead and already applied the beginning of a zenithal highlight, mostly so you can see details, but also I experienced technical difficulties, so I figured this would be an easier way to achieve this. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue this method. Load your brush up with a little bit of gray paint. I'm using a neutral gray by Vallejo. Wipe a little bit of it off onto a rag or a card. I'm going to use a rag. That's off camera. And you just want to gently go across where all of the raised edges of the model are. Now, for example here, you can see where it's catching the flat areas and the raised details. You're going to want to pivot around and get this little underside of the cape. Sorry about that. The model's being held on by a series of tapes since it's a very hard model to get arranged properly. You're going to want to avoid all the chainmail for this, since chainmail is typically something you want to leave black, as are most metals on a Mini, given the fact of the best base to start with metal is black. You can see here on the legs, we're not going crazy, we're just getting enough to catch the front of the leg, and the same applies to the boots. Just laying out our rudimentary shapes as to where our zenithal would begin, and our mid-tone would also start in shadow. Let me press that down a little more. Now, you're going to switch to a much brighter color for your second highlight color. Since the gray is already dried, I'm going to take another flat blending brush, in this case a Chinsel Blender number 4. You can use any brush you want, doesn't really matter. And load up a titanium white. And same method, wipe off most of it onto a brush. And this time go a little more heavy-handed. This will be your final tone. The reason I'm using this brush is because it's a little more stiff. The bristles are a little more rough. Trying my best to keep my hand of the shot here, but that may happen given what I'm working with. I'm making sure to really catch the edges of of the cape and the hood nicely to really pop in a detail. I'm just trying to hold the miniature still with my other hand, since using tape is a method that you usually shouldn't use, but for convenience sake, and because I'm lazy, I choose to use tape. The model is made of pewter. Typically, tape won't weigh a model down, but given the fact that the model is made of metal, it's very heavy. For those of you who have never experienced metal models, there are several reasons why they're a thing of the past. While they're gorgeous models, they also tend to have a lot of issues for beginners. But this character will never see the light of day in a plastic kit. I'm sure there was a reissue at some point, but I am not aware of that. Now, here we have our undertone, our midtone, and our highlight already laid out and established for us. This is essentially what the slap chop method does as well. But the method I'm trying to use is something a little more akin to the classic way these models would have been painted back in the 80s. Including our final base rim being a bright green as opposed to black or tan. Because we're trying to harken back to those old-fashioned models, we're going to, of course, use a recipe we've written where a After using a reference, we have gotten all the colors of the character, of his classic costume as portrayed in both the novels and his tabletop appearances, written down on a piece of card, so this way you can see the colors you're going to need. I'll explain some of these color mixtures as we go, since several color mixtures will obviously be kind of difficult. Now, to start the flesh tone, which is what we're going to focus on first, I'm going to use a base of Bugman's Glow. It's a nice, warm, medium flesh tone. In this case, we're going to thin it down just a little bit with some water to help it flow better. I'm going to use my Army Painter Monster brush, and I'm going to put a little bit onto the wet palette. Just enough to where it's noticeable. Rinse your brush. Thin your paint just a little bit with a little bit of water. And the consistency you want is to where when you touch it to your skin, it's semi-translucent. Rinse your brush again. And I'm going to use a Sable number 3 brush by Atlas. They're great brushes. Use any brush you feel comfortable with. I'm using this for the sake of smooth transitions and smooth laydown of color. And load your brush up just to the tip. You only want about that much paint on your brush. You don't want to overflow it. You don't want to get paint into the ferrule of the brush. If you do, your brush won't dry right. You'll get things like hooked tips. You'll cause splitting of the bristles. You really don't want that. So, start gently applying your Bugman's Glow to all the areas of the face. The highlight and lowlights we laid out before will help this thinned paint drying away. That'll make adding our final highlights and glazes easier. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can be a little messy. This is just a base coat. Don't worry about spilling over onto the hair or onto parts of the tunic, because again, you'll be patching that up later. Now, it's patchy, but that's because it's a thinned base coat. You will, of course, want to apply another coat, possibly 2, depending on how solid you want your base coat to be. Now, I'm going to take my brush again, and I'm going to just gently do the same method on the hands. We will layer in some other colors later, some purple tones and some red tones, to again add more of a liveliness to the flesh tone. And we're going to make sure we hit every finger. Again, if you hit a little bit of the chainmail or a little bit of the tunic, that's fine. It doesn't matter. And we're going to add a second coat to the face, since that is already dried at this point. So you're going to want to just add your second coat, getting that nice mid-color transition ready. And we're going to load up our brush one more time. We're going to add that second coat to this hand. The purpose for this video series is to show absolute beginners how to get a model table ready and still have nice, almost display quality miniatures without having to jump through hoops or tons of convoluted tutorials online. What I wish I would have had starting the hobby. Now, we're going to layer up to our next flesh tone. What that means is we're going to start introducing some reds and some purples to the tone to introduce a little bit of warmth and vibrancy I'm going to use AK's Human Flesh Tones, mostly because they're one of the best flesh tone sets on the market. When you order the package, you get, of course, a multitude from your darkest tones to your lightest tones. I'm going to, of course, use 3 colors out of this. Wine red, violet purple, and basic skin tone. In a series of course, layers and transitions, we're going to take a thinned version of each of these paints, and we're going to layer in details on mostly the face, avoiding the hands for the most part, since the hands are mostly covered by the tunic or the pommel of the sword blade. Again, we're going to add just a drop to our wet palette. You can see how AK paints are thick and tend to separate a little bit. We're going to get a slightly thinner brush, this time a 0 by Atlas. We're going to get our tip nice and sharp, and we're going to take just a little bit of water next to this, stir the two together, making sure the consistency is nice and thin and easy to work with. And we're going to wipe off the excess. Rinse our brush again, getting out of the ferrule leads, and it should be something like that. Now, we're going to gently glaze this into areas where we want shadow, but also to show a little bit of skin tone. So, glaze in areas like right here among the ear, and we'll do it in areas such as the cheekbone and inside the eye sockets, inside the nasal bridge, across the lips, across the lips, across the nasal bridge, into the eye socket, a little bit into the mustache region, a little bit here within this cheekbone. We're going to drag it all the way down to the chin here, since you can see with our zenithal highlight where it naturally places a shadow for us, meaning we want that to be some of our darkest colors. We want around here, little bits around the hairline where some shadow would naturally hang. And we're going to do the same here on this hand. And it should look something like this. A little strange seeing a purple face, obviously, but most of what we've done has been glazed in and highlighted to show shadow placement. We'll add a layer of red over this, and then we'll highlight up to our final flesh tone. And after that's done, we'll lay out our base tones for the cape and our base tones for the pants. And then in the next video, we will show the striping of the pants, how to freehand stripes, and how to paint leather details and metallics. As for right now, what we're focusing on, though, is solely skin tone. Is solely the skin tone of a human character. This method can be applied to any variety of character models, but one thing has to be remembered. Different species with different skin tones, this won't always work. One example is orcs. Orcs being a green skin tone, you'll layer things in a reverse manner. Vampires having a white tone, you'll layer things in sort of a backwards method, where you'll lay down your lightest tones first and work up to your darkest. But I'm sure that's something you've kind of figured out. Again, I'm using our red color, thinning it out a bit. One way to test it again is using your hand. That's translucent enough. You can see a little bit of our skin texture through it. That's what you want. Test it over on the purple. You can see the transition. Test it over the Bugsman's Glow. You can see the transition. That's how you know you've thinned your paint properly, when you layer it over other paint colors and it naturally changes the tone. Load up your brush again. This time, again, facing the tip of the brush, not wanting to get it into the ferrules or anything like that. I have a few wild hairs on my brush, but that can't be prevented. So we're going to shade up to areas where you get a lot of blood flow. So cheekbones mostly, inner ears, a little bit into the base of the nose. Really hitting a lot of the areas we didn't get the first time. Places that'll get the hottest when you run, obviously, such as your face, your cheeks. Areas like that, which is why we're applying a red tone into them. I like to add a little bit around the chin, too, to help break up a skin tone. We'll add a little bit into this cheek as well, a little bit here. We'll add a little bit just into the top of the hand here and add a smidge into the fingers towards the tips. We'll add a little more here just to smooth everything out. Same here. Make sure we catch all of this. And make sure it blends naturally back to where the cheekbone would be. The finished product should look something like this. You could use any red or purple tone you like. I'm using AK because I like how the products layer together, but if you're just starting out in the hobby, you could do whatever you feel comfortable with. Whatever tone you think will work the best is the tone you can use. Now, one thing to keep in mind when doing this is that human flesh tone is one of the hardest flesh tones to actually blend. If you can get the tone and the complete shifts between layers done properly, then you've mastered a product ahead of the game. You've mastered a method ahead of most. Now, we're going to try to not thin out our main flesh tone as much. We're going to thin it out just a small amount, leaving the paint almost untouched. And one way to tell is, again, it covers up our Bugman's Glow almost entirely. It glazes nicely into our red, glazes nicely into our purple. A little bit of purple was still wet. I did that to demonstrate what you want. A little bit of a light blending between them. That's why we're doing things while the paint on the model is still a little bit wet, just between that drying phase. Now, what you're going to do with your final flesh tone is you're going to start just lightly going in and painting into the nose, into the cheekbones, wanting to sort of glaze some of that color in. It looks a little pale right now, but once we had a wash over the flesh and pick out some of our final highlights, well, it'll really clean that up quite a bit. Again, it will look rough at first, but that's because skin tones tend to be very light pigmentation and tend to be very thin paints, meaning that they tend to usually not cover in one coat. It takes multiple passes, which in this case is a good thing, as we're trying to layer up skin tone. So, again, don't worry about covering eye sockets. Don't worry about being messy. This is just your base tones. You can be a little messy here. Making sure to get all of the exposed flesh of the face, though. Now, we're going to take and do the same method on the hands by starting here and working our way down throughout the shape of the hand, trying to leave just a little bit of our two underlaying colors peeking out just a little bit. The reason why there was no secondary tones added to the bottom side of that hand is because it's facing the ground where the light isn't hitting the model. Same rule applies with parts of this hand as well. There are parts we will completely avoid hitting. Now, I'm using some more modern methods like this to paint the flesh, since a lot of the older methods used when painting flesh on a model this old were very, very impractical. Now, here's something of what you should have for your flesh tone at this stage after only one coat of a base flesh tone. Still looks a little rough, but that's because the model is very... It's because the model's very roughly shaped in spots. This is a time when Games Workshop is still doing hand sculpting for almost 90% of their models. So, what we're going to do from here, it's simple. We're going to layer up another couple of layers of this flesh tone on the face and on the hands to really bring out a little bit brighter of a tone. And what we're going to do is we're going to use Cadian flesh tone. The reason why is because Cadian flesh tone is the next logical step up, and it'll help prevent a pale, washed out look to the model. You always want to shake Citadel paints nicely to get everything onto this little ridge. Get a little bit on our monster brush. Get it onto our wet palette. Rinse your brush. Now, we're not going to thin this as much because this is going to be more of a final layer. We're going to add just a little drop of water. Just a smidge. The palette will mostly be the one to do the thinning in this. So, going back to our small brush, we're going to load up a little bit more paint than we did last time, making sure it's able to cover. You can see there, it's able to cover nicely. That's what we want. Then we'll layer back to a lighter flesh in our final tone, somewhere between these two colors. And we're going to start here and work our way around the entire face of the model. Really trying to help these colors blend together. And that's why we've thinned paints, to help everything gain a warmth. Build up a little bit of a shadow tone within everything. That's really all miniature painting is building up light and shadow in areas they naturally would fall. Now, we're going to try to maintain lightness on this part of the hand and a little bit of darkness on the underside, since it's away from light. It's facing towards the ground. Making sure to try to keep this in frame. If not, well, these things happen. When working with such small figures, it's kind of hard sometimes to keep things in frame. I'm going to rinse off our brush. And we're going to let the flesh tones get a nice time to dry. And we're going to work on the other base tones of the cape and the pants in the next video.